reactions have continued to trail the launch of the Board of Peace by President Donald Trump. In a related development, President Trump has withdrawn Canada's invite to join the Board of Peace. Canadian Prime Minister launched his new, since he launched a new initiative, which is the Board of Peace. The Canadian Prime Minister McCartney gave a speech at the World Economic Forum, which many believed may have annoyed President Trump to have withdrawn that invitation to the country. But beyond that, there are those who fear, foreign policy experts fear, that a new Board of Peace launched by President Trump will rival the United Nations and see an end to its relevance, which has been dwindling in recent times. The United Nations has struggled to keep up with one of its mandate and responsibility, which is peacekeeping. And that is largely due to the non-payment of financial commitments by member states, the stark realities of a multipolar order, and the use of veto by permanent members of the United Nations Council. What does this Board of Peace mean for the global world order? Does it pivot power too much to President Trump? This is our conversation today as we bring in the 16th Council, Chairman 16th Council, Dr. Brian Rubin, and an international law expert, Livingstone Wichi. They join me for an in-depth analysis. Good to have you both join us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Dr. Brian, let me begin with you. This idea was born last year in a U.S.-led effort to end the war in Gaza, and it was endorsed then by a UN Security Council resolution. You would remember this was supposed to be part of the second phase of that proposal to end the war in Gaza. So what do you now make of the much greater and far grander global ambition of this Board of Peace? And does it pivot around the president just a little too much?
Well, thank you for having me, Precious. So the issue here is, I think one thing we need to actually recognize is the fact that this is happening in response to what the United Nations has become. You see, so my concern here is not really whether it gives too much power to Trump or otherwise, but about the fact that it became relevant actually in the first instance, because under the watch of the UN, there have been several wars that really just continues like that. Okay, so these signals are both attempts by the United States under President Trump to reshape global conflict management. And what he's trying to do is to own what is called narrative authority. So it's not just he's saying, look, the reason these wars continue is not just because they cannot be resolved. The reason they continue is because the institution mandated to resolve these issues clearly now lacks the ability, to resolve wars. And that's the reason why you see several wars continue and the United Nations simply issues communiques and press statements and sanctions and nothing changes. So this is a bold attempt to reshape the global conflict management. For Europe, this raises immediate questions. On one hand, it could duplicate or even rival the UN's role, which European nations have long relied on for legitimacy in mediation and peacekeeping. All right. On the other hand, it pressures the EU to, clarify its own foreign policy identity. Member states must navigate between aligning, with the US initiative and maintaining cohesion within the EU, particularly in sensitive relations, with a country like Russia. So to put it simple, the board could either sideline EU influence or act as a catalyst for the EU to assert strategic autonomy, more decisively. But you see, in the coming months, we're going to be able to see whether this becomes a partnership opportunity, for diplomatic challenge for Europe. But I don't want us to really miss the key issue here. And it is the fact that the United Nations has been, unable to resolve most of the wars that arise. And that's why this is even becoming necessary. This conversation...
Dr. Brian, let me bring in Livingstone into the conversation, because as I listen to you, you also find that one of the reasons the United Nations has not been able to resolve some of this conflict also has to do with the United States. First of all, they have veto power. Most times where there was a call for a ceasefire by the United Nations Security Council, in the Israel-Gaza war, it was the U.S. that used its veto to stop the ceasefire. So let me bring in Livingstone to react to what you have said in terms of this is meant to counter the non-relevance of the United Nations in recent times. Livingstone.
Well, the fact remains that the United Nations had a fundamental principle that resulted in its establishment from the League of Nations, and that is comment by the um, uh, Partnership for Global Peace Arrangement, as at the time the UN was established post Second World War. But today, the UN has become a committee of comrades where interest is now being weaponized and its fundamental principles have been set aside, kept in abeyance, kept in view, while the world continues to wallow in conflict and all manner of instabilities, particularly the developing states. As such, the United States intervention with the Board of Peace is a protest organization, in my view, which, if the UN realizes its onions, should rise should rise to the occasion and bring to fore its fundamental mandate to restore global peace. When an institution of that magnitude has lost trust, then it becomes difficult to have a proper working relationship with it. Donald Trump's administration proposed the Board of Peace, and its scope was limited to the reconstruction and the administration of Gaza Strip, but now has expanded to become a promoter for global peace and conflict management. That is a far-reaching mandate. And I think, as we all know as humans, there should be no room for vacuum. Nature abhors vacuum. There is a fundamental global vacuum right now pervading the international space. And as you may recall, internationalization and the definition and meaning given to international politics and relationship is expanding beyond what we have always known. So I understand the agitation by other stakeholders about the issue of Donald Trump proposing to be a permanent chairman of the Board of Peace, but that is not even the issue. The issue has to do with the trust for the restoration of peace and conflict management.
And Livingstone is let me stay with you on the points you've made, because we've seen the attempt by President Trump to broker peace in certain conflicts. For example, the DRC-Rwanda conflict. We saw how that quickly fell apart. We saw the Thailand-Cambodia conflict. We also saw how that quickly fell apart, and a couple of others. And I'm wondering, if that did not work then, what then will be the responsibility of a Board of Peace or the effectiveness of a Board of Peace where he is a lifelong chairman?
I think the factor of being a lifelong chairman is not the issue here, but he needs to build partnership.
My emphasis was on the effectiveness of that board. If he has failed in some regards to bring peace in some countries and some conflicts, what then will be the effectiveness of this Board of Peace?
He has also succeeded in some. You cannot, just as the United Nations has also recorded a measure of failure in a whole lot of issues, the Board of Peace has strong. You can see some of its success stories in Gaza currently, the ceasefire in Gaza, and the intervention between the Russia-Ukraine war, among other instances where Donald Trump has also intervened. This is not to justify in its entirety, but to say that this is a response. I agree with the other speaker, which stated that this is a response of what the United Nations has become today. We saw the case of Nigeria, where the question as to Christian genocide was raised, whether you like it or not, agree or disagree, but the intervention of the US has made the federal government to take extra measures, which we are yet to see the type of results that people desire, where Maduro in Venezuela disagree or agree was functioning as a despot in that country and allegedly promoting drug deals. The United Nations had to intervene. Now, it's already bringing some shivers around several state leaders. Now, this is also applicable to Africa. What has happened to the African Union, where the African Union only rises to condemn unconstitutional change of government without determining whether the governments themselves were constitutional. So it is my view that this particular development is aimed at redefining, revisiting, and reviewing how global conflict and peace is managed.
All right.
And
I want to bring in Dr. Brian.
Itself, then, yes.
I want to bring Dr. Brian back into the conversation. Dr. Brian, I want to quote what the Slovenia Prime Minister said, Robert Golob said. He said that it is this Board of Peace dangerously interferes with the broader international order. And we've seen how President Trump has withdrawn an invitation to Prime Minister Carney of Canada just because of comments he made in Davos. And I'm wondering, can President Trump be trusted to at the helm, not just the Board of Peace, we're talking about the international order here. Can he be trusted to lead at this time when we know, what it means for those he agrees with and those he doesn't agree with?
Well, that criticism actually proves President Trump's point rather than undermining it. What the so-called multilateral apologists are defending is not a rule-based order. It's a permission-based order where nothing happens unless everyone is comfortable, and therefore nothing decisive happens at all. When President Trump withdraws an invitation or applies pressure after Davos comments, that represents an impulsive destruction. It's leverage being used as diplomacy. Traditional multilateralism pretends leverage doesn't exist, but Trump puts it on the table. And here is actually the parish, in my opinion. The current international system confuses process with authority. The United Nations has procedures, it has legitimacy, language, but it lacks consequences. So Trump's approach, whether you like it or not, reintroduces consequence into global politics. Countries suddenly understand that wars have cost, alignment matters, and neutrality is no longer free. So the question isn't whether this interferes with international order. The question is whether the existing order is still capable of producing peace, restraint, or even outcomes. And right now, from Gaza to Ukraine to the Red Sea, the evidence says it isn't. And that vacuum is what Trump is exploiting and honestly feeling.
And the United Nations celebrated its 80th anniversary last year. I remember the speech from Nigeria and just a host of African nations calling for a reform of the United Nations and its Security Council. Did the United Nations miss a pivotal moment to make that reform last year when several calls were made? Dr. Brian, that question is for you.
Okay, thank you very much. So the short answer is yes, that was a missed moment and a big one. And what happened last year was not just another failed ceasefire. It was a rare alignment of global pressure, public outrage, and procedural visibility. You had an overwhelming majority of member states calling for action. Massive media attention on the Security Council paralysis, election cycle in key Western capitals when leaders are most sensitive to legitimacy arguments. So that combination doesn't happen often. But instead of using that moment, to force structural reform, even incremental reform, the system defaulted to ritual. Another resolution, another veto, another statement of deep concern. And reform moments don't come when things are calm. They come when system visibly breaks in front of the world.
All right, let me bring in Livingstone back to the conversation. Livingstone, Europe seems to be very cautious in terms of participating in this Board of Peace. Several statements have been made about Russia's participation. Some countries in Europe are just outrightly saying no, they are not going to be part of it. Does Europe stand, not just Europe, countries who are not part of this have been invited, do they stand a chance of missing out of key decisions being made around the world? And what is the implication for them, especially for the EU generally?
Well, you see, it now begins to justify the demands Africa have always made concerning the United Nations Security Council, where Africa is not a member. So Europe is now saying such an organization is being set up. We will not be part of it, not the whole of Europe, some parts of Europe. I understand Bulgaria, Hungary, and others who are quietly behind, because you say not all are bold enough to reject openly. Some of them do behind the scene relationship or engagement. But the coming days or the current situation has now raised the question that Africa always raised. You always had a permanent membership of the UN Security Council. Africa was never a member. Decisions were being taken. Now Europe will begin to feel that same bite. But again, you see, because Europe runs a community law system or a community legal system where the European Union acts as the governing body for the whole of Europe, they mostly speak with one voice. They are almost one state in their current form. But the implication there is that the rest of the world, particularly now that the Middle East, the Southern America, most of Asia, and others have come on board. I understand Russia is coming on board. Israel will come on board. It will now create a sharp divide. And I think the competition has become very, very necessary. So that nations like my friend has rightly pointed out, consequence has been brought into global politics. UN has slept for too long. UN has become too comfortable and has run an armchair system for too long. And now it is time to begin to wake them up. But it may become too late. But the challenge there may be, what will be the lifespan of the body of peace? The board of peace, rather. Because Donald Trump will not be president forever. Don't forget that. That notwithstanding, the intervention of America has begun to answer those questions that stakeholders have asked, intellectuals have asked, that what is the essence of the UN when its policies cannot be enforced? What is the essence of the African Union when enforcement cannot be made to despotic states and leadership, where our democracy definition in Africa has to do with any government, provided you have not been removed, in quote, unconstitutionally, without questioning whether the government itself is constitutional. So Europe will lose out completely, and they will be isolated, because there is a new move, a new wave, a new movement, a new order of renaissance, a new order, a revolutionary order that is questioning the status quo. It will begin to happen.
And
so
Livingstone,
when you now know you have a competitor, you will also bring your own bargaining chip on the table.
Livingstone, I want to quickly come in.
Very seriously.
Livingstone, just a minute. I have 2 minutes more. I want to give you a minute, and I want to give Dr. Brian a minute. But first to you, if you can answer this in a minute, because you said something quite important and interesting, which is the power of consequence, the consequence, and then the power of enforcement, which is what President Trump has now. But when he stops being president, he has given himself lifelong chairmanship of that board. It means that enforcement no longer lies, on the U.S. because he's no longer president. What then does that mean for the board?
Well, I believe they will have their long-term plan. They will not be short-lived by their plans. They will have their long-term plans, because U.S. is not the only member. And mind you, much as you may criticize Donald Trump, this is about America. It's not about Donald Trump. And the American interest, the America First arrangement, I believe, has been bought into by the stakeholders within the American polity. Don't be carried away by congressional arguments. But what matters to America right now is America's interest. And if this gives America more dominion within the global space, bear in mind that successive governments will have a way of sustaining the current system that Trump has brought in place.
I want to give the last minute now to Dr. Brian, and I'm just wondering how Africa should approach it, because we're always on the sidelines of everything. How should we approach the board of peace?
Yeah, that's correct. Africa always seems to be on the sideline. But you see, this movement is not about defending institutions. It's about understanding power as it actually operates. America is acting in his interests, and they're doing that quite openly, unapologetically, and even structurally. And you're right. The posture will likely outlive Trump. I mean, as my other speaker mentioned, it's going to outlive Trump, because it reflects a deeper recalibration inside the U.S. policy. not on personality. But Africa's mistake has always been to treat global politics as a moral forum instead of a marketplace of leverage. So what should Africa do? First, stop waiting to be invited. In a world of great power dominion, relevance is not granted, it is asserted. Second, Africa must aggregate power. No single African state has strategic weight alone, but collectively, Africa controls critical minerals, shipping corridors, votes in multilateral bodies, and even demographic feature. That must be converted into transactional leverage, not speeches. Third, Africa should deal with America the way America deals with the world. Interest to interest, principle to principle. So what does Africa offer? What does Africa withhold? What does Africa condition? Until those questions are answered collectively, Africa will remain present but not decisive. So this is a shift for me. Africa has to make this shift from the sideline
we have to leave it there
to table relevance.
Thank you both. Interesting perspective from you both. Chairman 16th Council UK, Dr. Brian Ruben, and international law expert Livingstone Wichi. A pleasure to have both of you on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, that's What Now. Thanks for watching. I am Precious Amayo.